Corah Sisk had one hen left, and she cooked it for a stranger, in trade for 11 miles of California road. She carried the covered dish across a cotton field at first light, and she did not ask twice. She owned nothing to pay with. So she offered the one thing that was hers outright. One supper, cooked by her hands, in his house. And the man looked at her a long moment and said, flat as a board, "I don't need feeding, ma'am." But the camp truck wouldn't run on a weekday, and there were 40 families waiting on it too, and a boy's school papers won't sign themselves. While she washed the one plate at his sink, tired, half to herself, she said a small thing about a dead kitchen. She did not remember saying it. And the widower, who had not heard a woman speak in his house since 1934, wrote it down inside himself. What he did with it comes later. If you believe love is built with two pairs of hands, this story is for you. Before we go on, do me one kindness, subscribe and tell me in the comments what city you're watching from. I read every one. Now, let's begin. The camp was called Arvin, out past Weed Patch in Kern County, and in October of 1937 it was full to the fence line. Government camp. Rows of tents on wood platforms, a sanitary unit with real showers, a meeting hall where they held Saturday dances nobody had the strength for. Corah Sisk had tent 14. She had come out of Sequoia County, Oklahoma, the year before, with a boy and a suitcase and a photograph of her mother, and not much past that. She picked cotton at 75 cents the hundredweight. You bent your back from can't see to can't see, and you dragged a sack long as a grave, and at the end of it, if your fingers were fast and your knees held, you had maybe $1.25 to show. She was fast. Her fingers had been fast since she was 6 years old. She kept one hen, a red hen, past her best laying, but she gave an egg most mornings, and an egg was an egg. And she had half a sack of flour standing in the corner of the tent like a small white guest. That was the whole of Corah Sisk's estate. One hen. Half a sack of flour. A boy. The boy was Dewey. 9 years old, all elbows, hair the color of dry corn. He had his mother's still way of watching a thing before he trusted it. He slept on a cot beside hers, and in the mornings he'd wake and look at her before he said a word, checking her face to see what kind of day it was going to be. She hated that in him, and loved it, both. There were 2 errands only she could do. And she carried them the way you carry a stone in your shoe. She would not set them down, and she would not let them go. The first was Dewey's school papers. The teacher in Bakersfield needed a parent's own hand on the enrollment, signed and dated, or the boy couldn't start the winter term. Corah could read a little and write her name careful and slow. And she meant to be the one to write it. Not a camp clerk, not a kindly neighbor, her own hand on her own boy's future. The second was the money order. Back home, her mother was sick, and the only thing Corah could send across those 2,000 miles was a paper dollar figure bought at the postal window in town. A postal money order for her mother. She had saved it out coin by coin, kept it knotted in a sock, and she would not spend it. Not on food, not on shoes, not on anything, because it was already promised to somebody who had raised her. Both errands were in town. Town was 11 miles off. And on the morning she'd set aside to go, the camp truck sat dead. It was a weekday. The camp truck ran folks to the fields, not to town, and never on a weekday when there was cotton standing white in the rows. She stood by its cold hood and understood, the way you understand weather, that it was not going to move for her. She could wait for Sunday. But the school papers were due, and her mother was sick now, not Sunday. She could have asked. There were men in the camp with wagons, with old cars, with a mule. Any one of them might have carried her the 11 miles and thought nothing of it. And that was exactly the trouble. They'd have thought nothing of it, and she'd have thought of nothing else. She'd have owed. She'd have carried that owing around inside her like a swallowed pin. Corah Sisk could not tell the difference between being a burden and being loved. So she refused the one to keep clear of the other. It was the great blind spot of her life, and she did not know she had it. She knew one thing. There was a grower down the field road, name of Voss, and on weekday mornings he hauled his own cotton trailer to the gin. She had seen him at it. A big square man, gray coming in at the temples, who worked alone and spoke to no one. His place lay on the Bakersfield road. If a body were riding his trailer, she'd pass the town on the way. She had nothing to offer him, no coin. And she would not ask a favor, because a favor is a debt with no bottom to it. But she had a hen. And she had hands. So she waited till the light came gray over the cotton, and she wrung the red hen's neck quick and clean without letting herself think about the eggs, and she dressed it and covered it in her one good dish, and she walked out across the field with the dish held level in both hands like something in church. Harlan Voss was loading his trailer when she came up the road. 40 acres behind him, all of it his and all of it mortgaged, though she didn't know that yet. He heaved the last bale, and he turned, and there was a woman standing at the edge of his yard holding a covered dish, and for a second he just looked at her like she'd stepped out of a year he'd stopped counting. "Mr. Voss," she said. "Ma'am, I need to get to town. Bakersfield, I got papers to sign and an order to buy, and the camp truck won't run today." She lifted the dish a little, the way you'd show a man your one card. "I can't pay you coin. I won't ask you a favor. But I'll cook you a supper for it. Tonight, in your house, off this hen, by my own hands." She held his eye. "Could I cook one supper in trade for the ride to town?" The morning was very quiet. Somewhere a dog barked once and quit. Harlan Voss looked at the dish, and he looked at the woman, and something moved behind his face that he did not let out. When he spoke it was flat and low. "I don't need feeding, ma'am. I didn't ask what you needed," she said. "I asked would you take the trade." And that turned him a little. She saw it. A man used to being the one who gives, met by a woman who would not take. He worked his jaw. He looked off at the road like the answer was parked down it. Then he said the thing that she would turn over in her mind for weeks after, though she couldn't have told you why it stuck. "Reckon that's a poor trade for you," he said. Not a poor trade for him. For her. As if he'd already done the sum on her side of the ledger and found her paying too much. Nobody had weighed a cost on her side in a long time. She didn't have a name for what it did to her, so she set it aside. "That's my arithmetic to do," she said. "Not yours." He gave one short nod. That was the whole of the bargain. He didn't shake on it. He just jerked his chin at the trailer and said, "Ride's rough. Sit forward, over the axle." And he set her dish careful in the cab where it wouldn't slide, careful as if it were his own, and she climbed up onto the cotton, and they went. 11 miles of the Bakersfield road on a cotton trailer is a long white noise of dust and jolt. He didn't talk. She didn't either. She watched his big hands on the wheel through the little window, and she thought, that is a man who has forgotten how to want anything out loud. He'd had a wife. Ruth. She learned the name later. Ruth Voss, buried in 1934, and since the day they put Ruth in the ground, Harlan Voss had answered every feeling he owned with lumber and nails. Because words had failed him at the graveside, and he'd never trusted them again after. When his heart was full, he built a fence. When it ached, he mended a roof that didn't need mending. He wanted, more than he wanted anything on this earth, to be of use to somebody again. And he could no more say that sentence out loud than he could fly. He wanted it so bad he'd said yes to a supper he swore he didn't need. He let her down at the edge of town, by the courthouse road, and told her plain he'd be at the gin 2 hours and she could find him there for the ride back. Then he drove on to wait his turn under the great shadow of the gin, and Corah walked into Bakersfield with her whole day's business in her chest. She signed Dewey's papers. The teacher was a young woman with ink on her middle finger, and she turned the enrollment sheet around and set the pen in Corah's hand, and Corah wrote her name slow and true, every letter, the way you'd lay stones in a wall. Corah Sisk. Mother, and the date. She blew on it so it wouldn't smudge. Her boy would start the winter term because she had come to town on the strength of a dead hen, and she felt, for one clean minute, rich. Then the postal window. She untied the sock. She pushed the coins across the counter and asked for a money order made to her mother's name back in Sequoia County, and the clerk stamped it and slid it back. And she folded it small and put it against her heart inside her dress. Bought and paid. Nobody's favor. Hers. She met Harlan at the gin and rode the empty trailer home in the falling light, and the cost of the day rode with her the whole way. Because now she had to make good on the supper, and the supper would cost her the laying hen, already dead, and half her flour. And a whole evening's work in a strange man's house. She meant to pay every ounce of it. That was the arithmetic she'd claimed as her own. She would not short him a mouthful. She got the boy fed at the tent first and left him with a neighbor woman she trusted. And then, past dark, she walked back down the field road to the Voss place to cook the supper she'd sold. His kitchen stopped her at the door. It was a lean-to on the north side of the house. A room built as an afterthought and never loved. A 2-burner kerosene stove, the wick blackened. No counter to speak of, a shelf, a dishpan, and that was the working of it. One window, set too high, so the light came in over your head and never down onto your hands. The table shoved flat against the wall like it was ashamed. And a stillness over all of it. A dust that wasn't dirt so much as absence. The particular cold of a room where no woman had cooked since 1934. She understood it in one look. This was the dead wife's kitchen. Nobody had moved a thing. Not because he honored it. Because he couldn't bear to touch it. Corah Sisk had cooked good food on worse than this. She tied back her hair and she went to work. She built the fire in the little stove and coaxed the kerosene to a steady blue. She cut the hen down and browned it in its own fat in the one iron skillet she could find. And she made a gravy of the drippings and a little of her flour. And she rolled biscuits out on a floured board balanced across the dishpan, because there was no counter to roll them on. She had to hold the light of the lamp in one hand and work with the other, half the time, because that high window gave her nothing, and the lamp sat wrong. She worked bent, the light on her back, her shadow falling forward over everything she did. And she made it beautiful. That was the thing. On a dead stove in a dead room, with half a sack of flour and one old hen, she set down a supper that steamed and smelled like Sunday. She called him in from wherever he'd been sitting in the dark of his own house, and she put the plate in front of him, and she stood back, because a cook stands back. He ate like a man who had forgotten food could be an occasion. He didn't say much. Once he said, "That's good." Just that. But he said it looking at the plate like the plate had done something to him. She wouldn't sit and eat with him, that wasn't in the trade, and to sit would be to take. She ate a biscuit standing, and she watched him have his supper, and when he was done she carried the one plate to the dishpan to wash it. Because a job's not finished till the dishes are done. She was tired all the way through. The day had been 11 miles of dust, and a signed paper, and a bought order, and a whole meal cooked bent backed in the cold. And she stood at that dishpan under the useless high window with her wrists down in the gray water, and she said a thing. She didn't mean to say it. It came up out of the tiredness on its own, half to herself, the way a person talks to a window. A woman ought to have the light on her hands, she said, not on her back. That was all. She rinsed the plate and set it to drain, and she never gave the words another thought. They fell out of her, and she forgot them the same second, the way you forget a breath. But Harlan Voss was standing in the doorway of his own dead kitchen, and he had not heard a woman say anything at all, in his own house, in 3 years. And a sentence about light and hands landed in that silence like a coin dropped down a well. He heard it go all the way down. He didn't answer her. He wouldn't have known how. He just stood there, and inside himself, without a word crossing his lips, he wrote it down. A woman ought to have the light on her hands, not on her back. He put it somewhere he kept things, and he closed his face over it, and he said, "I'll walk you back to the road." And what he was going to do with that sentence, that's the loop that runs under this whole story. Hold on to it. He walked her to the edge of his yard. The trade was square. She had paid in full and owed nothing, which was exactly how she needed the world to be, and she went back up the field road to her boy feeling clean and level, a woman who had cost no one a thing. It should have ended there. A supper for a ride. Even trade. Two people who'd shake hands, or not even. And go on being strangers 11 miles apart. But the season was turning. Cotton at 75 cents the hundredweight is a thing that runs out. By the end of October, the bolls were picked thin, and the rows you'd already stripped stood there gray, and every picker in the camp knew the arithmetic. Less cotton meant less weight, meant less coin, and winter was coming. And the government camp could shelter you, but it couldn't feed you. Corah felt the season closing like a hand. And then the boy took a fever. It came on Dewey in an afternoon. By dark he was hot as the stove had been, cheeks red, eyes glassed, talking a little to people who weren't in the tent. She had no medicine. She had a rag and a bucket and her own 2 hands. And she sat over him wringing cool water on his forehead while he shook. And she was more afraid than she let her face show. Because a fever in a tent in October, 11 miles from a doctor, is a thing that takes children. She didn't know how Harlan Voss knew. Camp news travels, and maybe the neighbor woman said it in his hearing at the store. But past 9 o'clock there was a step outside her tent and a knuckle on the pole, and she pulled the flap, and there he stood in the cold with his hat in his hand and a can of milk held out in front of him like an apology. "Heard the boys poorly," he said. "Canned milk. Condensed, sweet, the kind of thing a sick child could keep down when he'd keep down nothing else." She looked at the can, and she looked at the man, and every instinct she had said, "Don't take it. Taking is owing. Owing is the pin in the throat." But it wasn't for her. It was for Dewey. That was the crack in her wall. She could refuse the whole world on her own account. She could not refuse a thing that might cool her boy's fever. So she stood aside and let Harlan Voss into her tent. And she hated it. She hated the helplessness of it. She hated that she could not open a ledger and write down exactly what a can of milk and a night of a man's time came to so she could pay it back to the penny. There was no price on it. That was what undid her. A thing with no price is a thing you can never square. He didn't crowd her. He sat on an upturned crate on the far side of the cot, hat on his knee, and he tended the fire in the little sheet iron stove so the tent stayed warm, and every so often he wet the rag fresh and handed it to her without a word. He was of use. That was all he wanted in the world, and he'd found a place to be it, and he asked nothing back, and that was the loudest thing about him. The fever broke a little before dawn. It broke the way they do. All at once, the boy going from shaking dry heat to a sudden clean sweat, and his eyes cleared and found her, and he said, "Mama, I'm thirsty," in his own plain voice. And Corah put her face down against his damp hair and breathed for what felt like the first time in hours. When she raised up, Harlan was already standing, putting his hat on, making himself small toward the door the way a decent man does when the crisis is past, and his staying would only be a thing she'd have to manage. "He'll do now," Harlan said. And Corah Sisk, who guarded the giving of anything the way a poor woman guards a coin, heard herself say his given name for the first time. Not Mr. Voss, not Sir. "Thank you, Harlan." He stopped at the tent flap. He didn't turn all the way around. But she saw his shoulders take it, the sound of his own name in her mouth, like a man taking a weight he was glad to carry. Then he ducked out into the gray, and she heard his boots go off up the field road, and she sat a long time in the warm tent with her sleeping boy and the empty milk can, and a debt she could not put a number to. After that, things began that she didn't see the shape of. Harlan Voss started hauling more than cotton to the gin. A man who took a trailer of cotton to town and came back with a trailer of lumber, that got noticed. Rough pine, planed boards, a keg of nails. And then, of all the things for a widower to do in the last week of October, he sent off to the mail-order catalog and bought a window. Not a pane to fix a broken one. A whole double-sash window, wide, the kind that lets the light pour down instead of over. The camp saw it, and the camp talked. A grower buying glass in October. A widower who hadn't changed a nail on that house since he buried his wife, suddenly hauling lumber like a man with a plan. And it didn't take the camp long to set the lumber beside the supper she'd cooked and the night he'd sat her boy's fever, and to draw the line between them and to make it dirty. Because that was the other season closing in. A migrant woman and a landed grower, that was a scandal that cut both ways. The camp women looked at Corah sideways, a woman getting above herself. A woman trading suppers for who knew what. And among the growers and the townfolk, a man of 40 acres taking up with a tent woman off the Oklahoma road was a man making a fool of his name. The county had eyes, and both directions the eyes were cold. There was no version of Corah Sisk and Harlan Voss that the world around them would call clean. She felt it before she understood it. Felt the camp go quiet when she passed. Felt the weight of being talked about, and it frightened her worse than the fever had, because she had spent her whole life making certain she cost nobody anything, and now she was costing a good man his good name, and she couldn't even pay that back. There's no money order for a reputation. And she still didn't know the half of what he was doing. Because in the gray light before winter, in the last stretch between the final cotton and Christmas, Harlan Voss walked into Ruth's dead kitchen with a wrecking bar in his hand. There was a wall in that house. The load-bearing wall between the lean-to kitchen and the back bedroom. It had stood 19 years since he and Ruth raised the place, and it held up a share of the roof. And no man in his right mind pulls out a wall like that in the cold with a note coming due. He set the bar behind the first board and he pulled. He worked alone, the way he did everything. He pried the plaster and lath off in sheets and stacked the good lumber and knocked the frame loose stud by stud, and the cold poured through the gap he was opening. And the dust of 19 years hung in the one high beam of light. He was not fixing that kitchen. He was killing it. He was tearing down the room his dead wife had cooked in and never loved, and opening it up wide toward the north side of the house, where the light was. He set the range where the north light would fall on it. He framed a place for the big double-sash window he'd bought, low and wide, so the light would come down. And under that window he began to frame a work counter, a real one, a surface a woman could roll biscuits on standing straight. But he could not ask her a single measurement. He couldn't say a woman's name and a tape measure in the same breath. Couldn't walk up to Corah Sisk and ask her how high her hands liked to work, because to ask would be to say out loud the thing he didn't have words for. So he did the only thing a man like Harlan Voss knows how to do. He took the measurement from the world instead of the woman. He remembered the dishpan. He remembered where her wrists had fallen the night she stood at his sink and washed the one plate and said the thing about the light. He went to that old sink and he found the worn place on its edge, low, where her wrists had rested, and he set his rule against it, and he read off a number that no one had given him. And he cut his counter to that. Low, 3 inches under any standard a lumberyard would tell you. Wrong for any woman on earth but one. He didn't know if she'd ever stand at it. He was building a room to the measure of a sentence he'd overheard, cutting pine to the height of one woman's wrists, and if she said no, he could never uncut it. But his hands had found a thing to say that his mouth never could, and he could not stop them now. Board by board, in the cold. With the note coming due and the camp talking and the whole county watching, Harlan Voss tore out a 19-year wall and began to build, in secret, the one kitchen in the world that would fit Corah Sisk and no one else. And 11 miles up the field road, in tent 14, Corah sat with her healing boy and her half-sack of flour and turned over a debt she couldn't name. And swore to herself she'd find some way to pay the man back for the milk, for the fever night, for all of it, never once dreaming what he was already building her back, or what it was going to cost him when the note came due. The Sunday after Dewey could walk again, Corah did a thing she had not planned. She got up before the boy. She built the fire in the sheet iron stove. And she cooked, out of that half-sack of flour, a mess of biscuits and a little side meat she'd traded 2 eggs for. She wrapped it in a clean flour sack towel. Then she took Dewey by the hand and started up the field road toward the Voss place, 11 miles of nothing, her breath white in front of her. She told herself it was the milk. She told herself it was the fever night. A woman pays what she owes. But her feet knew better. Her feet were walking her from a trade she'd struck to a thing she'd chosen, and there is no ledger line for that. She just didn't have the word yet. Harlan met her in the yard. He'd been at something in the house, and he came out wiping his hands, and when he saw her standing there with the boy and the towel-wrapped dish, something crossed his face that he put away fast. "Wasn't a Sunday on the books," he said. "No," Corah said. "It wasn't." She stepped past him toward the kitchen door, and he moved. Quick, he put himself between her and that north side of the house, easy, like a man just happening to stand there. "Not that room," he said. "Cold in there. Cook in the front." So she cooked in the front, on the little stove, and it wasn't right, and both of them knew it, and neither of them said it. Dewey ate 3 biscuits and fell asleep in Harlan's good chair. And Corah watched the man watch her boy sleep, and she felt the debt swing around inside her again, heavier, and no way to weigh it. She did not know what was behind that north wall. She only knew he wouldn't let her see it. He built through November. In the evenings, after the last of the cotton was ginned and the days went short, Harlan Voss stood in the wreck of Ruth's kitchen with a lamp in one hand and cut pine. He set the range where the north light came in clean. He framed the counter under the place the new window would go. And he cut that counter low, 3 inches under any figure a lumberyard would hand you. He'd read the number off the worn edge of the old sink, off the place her wrists had rested the night she washed the one plate. And he cut the whole room to it. It was a foolish thing. He knew it was a foolish thing. A counter that height fit one woman on the earth and made every other woman stoop. If she said no, he could never uncut it. He'd have a kitchen shaped to a ghost that wasn't even Ruth. But his hands had found the one thing to say that his mouth never could, and a man doesn't stop his hands once they've started talking. Twice that month she came, and twice he headed her off. The first time he stood in the front room, and he said, real casual, "Got something in the house I'd show you." And Corah looked at the north door, and looked at him, and shook her head. "I'll stay where I'm standing," she said. Because a migrant woman does not walk into a room she cannot pay for. She'd learned that on the road. You don't take the seat, you don't take the second helping. You don't step into the parlor. What you accept you owe, and what you owe you carry, and Corah Sisk had carried enough. The second time he tried, she was drying her hands, and he said, "Corah, just come look." And she set the towel down square on the table and she said, "Harlan, I can't." And he heard the whole of it in those 2 words. She wasn't refusing the room. She was refusing to owe him a thing that big. He put the lamp down and let it go. The camp had plenty to say about all of it. The widower was buying glass in October. A mail-order window, the freight man told somebody, and somebody told somebody, and by the water tap it was a settled fact that Harlan Voss had lost his mind over the Oklahoma woman in Tent 14. The gossip woman at the tap went quiet when Corah came up with her bucket. Just quiet. Turned her shoulder and studied the far hills. A grower and a picker. It was a scandal from both ends. His people thought he was throwing himself away on a woman who owned a hen and half a sack of flour. Her people thought she was working an angle, softening up a landowner, trading on a dead man's loneliness. Neither side had it right. Nobody ever does. Corah heard it all. She held her chin level, and she picked the last of the cotton, and she said nothing. But at night, in the tent, she'd lie awake and think about that closed north door, and she'd wonder what a man could be building in there that he couldn't show her. And under that, a smaller thought she wouldn't look at straight. What if it was hers? Then, the first week of December, a car she didn't know came up the field road. She was at Harlan's that afternoon. She'd brought a covered dish, sat it in the cab of his truck out of habit, and she was in the front room when the knock came. A soft man in a town coat, hat in his hand, a leather folder under his arm. He looked at Corah, and he looked at Harlan. and he made a little sound in his nose that said he'd file her under something later. "Mr. Voss," he said. "Prentice, Cordell Land and Mortgage." Harlan's whole body changed. Corah saw it. He stood up out of himself like a man standing up to take a hit. "I know who you are," Harlan said. "Then you know why I'm out this far on a cold day." Prentice opened the folder. He had the ease of a man who has done this to 100 kitchens. The note. $214. Due the 4th of January. "I'm making my rounds early this year on account of I don't like surprises come the new year, and I don't expect my company likes them either." He looked around the front room, and his eyes went to the north door. Standing open now on a raw framed wall and fresh pine, and a range moved off its old feet. "I heard talk you'd been improving the property." "That's my business," Harlan said. "It's the company's business, Mr. Voss, when the improvement is bought with the note money." Prentice said it gentle, which made it worse. "You sold a heifer in October. Good milk heifer. And you've had lumber freighted, and glass, a mail-order sash, the whole works." He nodded at the torn-out wall like it was a corpse. "You tore out a wall that was holding, and you spent the payment on it. Now, I've been at this 19 years. I have seen a man ruin himself 100 ways. But I never once saw a man tear down a sound wall to do it." He shook his head, almost kind. 4th of January. $214, or the company takes its 40 acres. I'd hate it. But I'd do it. He put his hat on. He nodded at Corah, that little filing nod. And he went out to his car and drove back down the field road and left the whole thing lying open on the floor. Corah stood in the middle of the front room and did not move. She was doing the arithmetic. She couldn't help it. Arithmetic was the one thing she'd always had. He sold the heifer. He spent the note. He bought lumber and glass and a mail-order window in October, and he tore out a wall that was holding. And she turned, slow, and she looked at the north door he'd never let her through. "Harlan," she said, "show me now." He didn't want to. She saw that too. He'd wanted it to be Christmas, finished, the window in, the light right. He'd wanted to earn the showing. But it was out of his hands now, the way the note was out of his hands, and so he stepped aside and let her walk into the room he'd sworn to himself she'd only ever see done. She stood in the doorway of Ruth Voss's dead kitchen made new. The range was set in the north light. There was a work counter framed under a big raw opening where the double window would go. Catalog glass leaned against the wall still in its slats. Sawdust everywhere. Pine so fresh it was near white. And the counter, that long, clean run of planed board where a woman would stand and work. Corah walked to it. She set her wrists on the edge of it, the way a body does without thinking. And it fit. It fit her exactly. Not a stretch, not a stoop. Her wrists lay along that pine like it had been poured around them, and the light from the raw window opening came down and fell across the backs of her hands, right where she'd stand, right where the plates would be. Not on her back, on her hands. She heard her own voice come back to her from months ago, half to herself, tired. At a sink she thought no one was listening at. A woman ought to have the light on her hands, not on her back. She'd said it once. She hadn't remembered saying it. And here it was, built, cut in pine 3 inches under standard, wrong for every woman alive but her, set where the north light would fall on a body doing the work. He had written it down. Not on paper. In the room. He'd been listening. That was the thing that took her legs out from under her. Near, not that he'd built it. That a man had heard the one small true thing she'd let slip in a house that hadn't heard a woman in 3 years, and he'd taken it inside himself, and he'd carried it around, and he'd spent his heifer and his note and his 40 acres turning it into a place where she could stand. And it was going to cost him the farm. That was the other thing she understood, standing there with her wrists on the counter. The note came due on the 4th. He'd spent it on this. He'd bet the ground he stood on against a sentence she didn't even know she'd said. And if she took this room, she took the ruin with it. She'd be the woman a good man lost 40 acres over. She would be, at last and forever, a cost. The one thing she'd walked 2,000 miles swearing never to be. She took her wrists off the counter. "You shouldn't have," she said. Her voice was flat. It had to be flat or it would break. "You shouldn't have done this, Harlan, Corah, a milk heifer. Your note." You tore out a wall that was standing. She was quoting Prentice now, and she knew it, and she couldn't stop. "For a kitchen. For me. And I never asked you. I never once asked you for a single board." "I know it," he said. "That's why I done it." She had no answer to that. That was the trouble. There was no answer to that. So she did what she knew how to do. She went home and she started folding the tent. The last cotton was picked. The season was done at 75 cents the hundredweight and then nothing. The camp truck was running again, weekdays and all. She could ride to the highway. She could go north or back east, 2,000 miles back the way she'd come. She could take her boy and her half sack of flour and her mother's photograph and be gone before the 4th of January. And then no note in the county would have her name anywhere near it, and Harlan Voss could sell that mad low counter for firewood and pay his note and keep his ground. She refused the room. She'd told him no to his face. Twice at the doorway and once inside it, and that made 3, and the folding of the tent made 4. 4 refusals. A woman protecting the last thing she owned, which was the right to owe nobody. She folded canvas most of one day. And somewhere in the folding, down on her knees in the cold with the tent rope stiff in her hands, the arithmetic in her turned over and showed her its other side. She'd been figuring it all wrong. She'd been figuring how not to be a cost. But a cost is a thing you can pay. That's what a cost is. If it could be named, it could be worked, and if it could be worked, then it wasn't charity, was it? It was a debt. And Corah Sisk had never once in her life run from a debt she could name. She stopped folding. She went into the tent, and she got a sheet of flour paper, the brown kind, and the stub of a pencil Dewey did his letters with. And she ruled it. Straight lines. Like a real account. Because that's what it was going to be. And she wrote it out. The next morning she walked the 11 miles one more time, in her coat, the paper folded in her hand. She went into the new kitchen where the range sat cold and Prentice's notice still lay on the table where a soft man had left it. Harlan came in from the yard and stopped when he saw her, because he'd thought she was gone. Corah put the flour paper down on the table next to the notice. She kept her coat on. She kept her chin level. "I won't take the room," she said. "You hear me. I won't be given it. But I'll work it out." He looked at the paper. "Suppers," she said, "cooked by me, in this kitchen, 1 a week. At a price I set, and I set it fair. 40 cents the meal. Same as any camp mess would charge a working man, no favor in it either way. 40 cents a Sunday, credited against what this room cost, till it's square." She put her finger on the figure at the bottom. "Near $200, the way I make it. That's the room. That's what I owe on it. And 40 cents a week against $200, she stopped. Because they were both doing it now. The arithmetic. Standing there in the cold kitchen doing the same sum in the same silence. 40 cents a week. $200. 4 years. 4 years of Sundays. 200 and some suppers, 1 every week. Cooked in this kitchen at this low counter under that window, winter and summer, for near 4 years before the account came square. Both of them knew what the figure said. Both of them knew it wasn't a bill of sale for a kitchen. You don't agree to stand in a man's house every Sunday for 4 years over lumber. She'd handed him a paper that said kitchen and meant something there wasn't a paper for, and she'd made it a thing she could pay, so that taking it wasn't taking. It was working. It was owing and paying. Honest. In the only coin she trusted. which was her own 2 hands. Harlan Voss looked at that ruled paper a long time. Then he took the pencil stub off the table. He wrote one word under her figure, big and plain, the way a man signs who doesn't trust words and has found the only one he needs. Square, and he signed his name under it. That was the whole of the proposal that was never a proposal, and the whole of the yes that was never a yes. A ruled sheet of flower paper. 40 cents a Sunday. 4 years. Square, but there was still the note. 4 years of Sundays don't help a man who loses his ground on the 4th of January. So Corah did the last thing she was good at. She sat down at that cold counter with the whole tangle of Harlan's gin tickets, the carbon slips, the trailer weights, near 4 years of a lonely man's bad bookkeeping stuffed in a cigar box, and she went through them the way she went through everything. One figure at a time, level-eyed. And she found it. She'd near found it once before and let it lie. The cotton factor's short loads. 3 separate trailers. Back that fall weighed light at the gin. She laid the tickets out and matched the weights against what a trailer that size carried, and the numbers didn't sit right, and they didn't sit right in Harlan's favor. Near $90 of cotton hauled 2,000 miles worth of California road and never paid for. $90 the factor owed a man who'd been too grief-worn and too alone to check the scale. $90. Against a $214 note. It wasn't the whole of it. But it was the difference between a man who could meet his obligation and a man who couldn't. It was the swing. She took the tickets to the gin office herself. She made Harlan bring Prentice, so there'd be a witness, so it would all be square and above board and no favor anywhere. And she laid the tickets on the counter in front of the factor's man, and she showed him the weights, 1 trailer at a time, in her flat-picking camp voice that didn't rise and didn't beg. "That's short," she said. "And that's short. And that one there's short worst of all. 3 loads. Near $90 owed to this man, and owed since fall." The factor's man argued. They always argue. But the tickets were the tickets, and the weights were the weights, and Corah Sisk had never once been wrong on a figure in her life. He paid it. $90, near enough, counted out onto the gin office counter. And Prentice stood there in his town coat and watched a migrant woman find the money that saved the farm he'd come to take. He'd called that torn-out wall a fool's ruin, 19 years at it, and he'd never seen a man tear down a sound wall to spend himself. He'd read it wrong, top to bottom. He'd read it as a fool losing everything. He'd never once read it as a man choosing what to lose it for. He took his pen out. He signed the extension. He put the note money forward against the 90 and the 4 years of Sundays and whatever else Cordell Land and Mortgage figured a settled working 40 acres was worth, and the farm held. It just held. He put his hat on the same way he had before, but the little filing nod was gone. He looked at Corah with something closer to respect, and he didn't say anything, because there wasn't anything to say. He drove back down the field road for the last time. The public that had judged them stood outside the gin office and watched the ledger prove them. There's no arguing a squared account. There was one more room to open, and it wasn't made of pine. That evening Harlan took the old high window out of the north wall, the single high sash that had let a little cold light down into Ruth's kitchen for 19 years, and he leaned it in the shed. And Corah found him standing there with it, in the dark, not working. Just standing, the way a man stands at a graveside. He told her then. Plain, the way he did everything. He told her about Ruth. About 1934. About the sink he'd never been able to bring himself to change. And the kitchen he'd let go cold because to fix it would be to say she was gone. And he hadn't been able to say she was gone. Not at the graveside. Not after. Not for 3 years. He told her the words had failed him when Ruth died, and he'd never trusted them since, and that was why he built things instead. That was why there was a room and not a sentence. Corah listened. She didn't compete with the dead. She'd buried enough of her own to know better than that. A living woman doesn't win against a ghost by making the man choose. She wins by making room. "That high window," she said. "Ruth's window. Don't put it in the shed." Harlan looked at her. "Set it over the new one," she said. "Over the counter. The old high sash up top and the new double one below. Then the old light and the new light fall together on the same hands, and nobody has to be gone for anybody to be here." She put her hand flat on the cold glass in the dark. "There's light enough in a window for two women, Harlan, there always was. So that's how they hung it. Ruth's high sash up top, the new double window below, and the ghost was let go, not shoved out. Set up high where the first light of a morning would still come through it, onto the hands of the woman who came after, who never once asked the dead to leave. By Christmas, the room was done. It snowed a little that week, which it does not much do down in that country, and the light off the snow came up soft and clean through both windows at once, and lay along the low pine counter like it had been waiting 19 years to land there. The camp came. Word had gone all around by then, the note and the tickets and the ruled paper, and the whole thing had turned in the telling from a scandal into something people wanted to stand near. They crowded the kitchen door, the migrant families out of the Arvin camp, in their washed and mended best. The schoolteacher came, the one who'd signed Dewey's enrollment papers back in October, and she stood in the doorway and called across the room, clear, so everyone heard it. "Merry Christmas, Mrs. Sisk," and used the Mrs. in front of the whole crowd like a woman setting down a marker. And the gossip woman came too, the one who'd turned her shoulder at the water tap. She stood at the doorsill, and she looked at the low counter and the double light and the boy with color in his face, and she opened her mouth. And then she closed it. She didn't say a single hard thing. She just went quiet, the way she'd gone quiet at the tap, only this was a different quiet. And everybody knew the difference. Corah stood at the counter. She was cooking Christmas dinner for the whole crowd of them, 40 cents worth of nothing turned into plenty the way she could. And the light came down through Ruth's old window and Harlan's new one both. And it fell on the backs of her hands where they worked, right where she'd said, "A woman ought to have the light on her hands." She'd said it once, over a dishpan, to a man she was sure wasn't listening. And here it was, true, in front of the whole county, snow light on her working hands in a room built to her wrists. He never proposed. She'll tell you that herself if you ask her, which nobody does. He never got down and asked, and she never once said yes. There wasn't a ring, and there wasn't a preacher, not that Christmas anyway. There was a sheet of flower paper that said 40 cents a Sunday, and one word under it that said square, and there was a room. Some things get said in Pine that never get said in church. In January, Harlan took a pencil to the door jamb. It was the jamb of the north door, right about where the load-bearing wall had stood for 19 years, the wall he'd torn out with a wrecking bar in the cold. Now it was a doorway, an opening, a way through. And he stood Dewey up against it. The boy all elbows and hair the color of dry corn, and he set the pencil flat on the top of the boy's head and made a mark on the jamb. Just a line. A boy's height, in pencil, on the frame of a door that used to be a wall. That's the whole of it. That's the one dry line that came down from her to everything she pretended not to understand. A wall came down. A door went in. And a growing boy got measured against it, which is the thing you only do to a frame you mean to keep, in a house you mean to stay in, for a child you mean to raise. So think on the two of them a minute. The woman who was given a ride to town, 11 miles up a cotton road, because she cooked one supper for a stranger and would not ask twice. And the woman who had a whole kitchen built to the height of her wrists, from one sentence she let slip and forgot, by a man who couldn't say a word of what he meant. They're the same woman. That's the thing. Corah Sisk is both of them. And the whole story, start to end, is just the distance between an 11-mile favor and 3 inches of pine. Between what a proud woman will ask for, which is almost nothing, and what she's worth, which is a room in the world cut to fit her and no one else. She offered one supper for a ride. And she found out, months later and near too late, that somebody had written down the one small true thing she said, and kept it, and built it, and would have lost his own ground rather than let it go unbuilt. That's what love looks like, when it can't find the words. It looks like a wall torn out. It looks like a countercut low. It looks like the light, falling at last on a good woman's hands. If you've got someone who'd tear out a wall for you and never once say why, tell me about them. Tell me your city, down below, and tell me the one small thing somebody built for you that you didn't ask for. I'd like to know. And I'd like to know I'm not the only one who thinks a room like that is worth more than gold.